My mother-in-law handed me a gift box at Christmas dinner. Silver paper, red velvet ribbon. Every single person at that table stopped eating to watch because Diane never did anything without an audience. Inside the box were 2 keys on a paper tag and a folded document. And when I unfolded that document, I understood 3 things at the exact same second. That she had already sold the house my husband and I lived in. That she had started the paperwork back in October, 18 days after I lost my baby. And that she waited until 14 people were watching me eat her food because, in a room full of witnesses, a woman like me is supposed to smile. She thought she'd picked the perfect moment. She had no idea what I do for a living. My name is Maren Vance. When this happened, I was 34 years old, and I lived in a small town in northern Michigan called Brightwater, about 20 minutes outside Traverse City, on the kind of road where everybody knows whose truck is whose. Let me tell you about the house first, because the house is the whole story. It's called the Cormorant House. It's a 1937 lake cottage on Bell Harbor Road, gray cedar shingles gone soft and silver from 80-some winters, a screened porch that faces east across the bay, and a stone chimney that a man named Sivert Lund laid by hand the year my husband's grandmother was born. That grandmother was Rose Vance. Rose lived in that house for 61 years. She raised 3 children in it, buried a husband from it, and she died in the back bedroom in March of 2021, 88 years old, holding my husband's hand and complaining that the bird feeder was empty. Rose left the Cormorant House to my husband Ellis. Everyone calls him Eli. Not to her daughter-in-law. Not split 3 ways. To Eli outright by name. In a will she signed in front of 2 witnesses and an attorney named Harlan Boyd. Remember that name, Harlan Boyd. It matters later. Now, Eli and I got that house in 2021, and what we got was a beautiful ruin. The roof was original. The wiring was cloth-wrapped. There was a hole in the porch floor big enough that Rose had covered it with a cookie sheet and a decorative rug and called it handled. We spent 3.5 years fixing it. And I don't mean we hired people. Eli restores wooden boats for a living. He works at a boatyard on the west arm of the bay, and he has hands that know how wood wants to move. He rebuilt the porch himself. He scarfed in new sill beams over 2 summers, lying on his back in a crawl space in 90-degree heat. I did the rest. I stripped 90 years of paint off the window sashes with a heat gun and a scraper, 1 at a time, 41 windows in a garage with a space heater and a podcast. I reglazed every one of them. I refinished the floors. I learned plaster from YouTube videos and made a mess of the dining room ceiling twice before I got it right the 3rd time. Every dollar we had went into that house, both our tax refunds 4 years running, my grandmother's little inheritance, the money we were supposed to use for a honeymoon we never took, that house was not a place we lived. It was a thing we built out of our own hours. I want you to hold on to that because in about 10 minutes, a woman in a cream cashmere sweater is going to hand it to a stranger like it's a casserole dish she's returning. Diane Vance was 63 that Christmas. She was a retired middle school principal, and I want you to really sit with that because it explains almost everything about her. For 29 years, Diane stood in front of rooms full of people who were legally required to do what she said. She had a voice that could stop a hallway. She had a way of saying your full name that made adults check their posture. And when she retired, all of that had nowhere to go, so it went into her family. Diane was president of the Brightwater Garden Society. She was on the library board. She ran the Christmas walk downtown for 11 years. If you asked anyone in that town about Diane Vance, they would tell you she was a saint. They would tell you about the casseroles she brought when the Kellerman's barn burned. They would be telling you the truth. Here is the thing people don't understand about women like Diane. She was never cruel in a way you could point at. She never yelled at me, not once in 9 years. She never called me a name. If I had tried to describe what she did to a stranger, I would have sounded insane, and she knew it, and that was the engine of the whole thing. She said things like, Maren, honey, you look tired. Are you sleeping? Eli, is she sleeping? She said, well, I would have used the good glasses, but this is fine, too. She looked at my job. I'm a title examiner. I'll explain in a minute. And she said, at Easter to a table of people. Maren does something with paperwork at the courthouse. Isn't that nice? It's steady. It's steady, like a bus route. She reorganized my kitchen while I was at work. Twice. She said the flow was wrong. She had a key to the Cormorant house. She'd had one since 1994, and when we moved in and I gently suggested that maybe we'd rekey it since we were doing construction, she got quiet for 4 seconds and then said, "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable in Rose's house." Rose's house, not ours, never ours, 4 years, and it was still Rose's house, and Diane was still the one holding the key to it. We didn't rekey it. That was a mistake, and I'll be paying for that mistake in small ways for the rest of my life. There's one more thing you need to know about Diane before we get to Christmas. Diane had wanted that house for 30 years. Not in a vague way. Aunt June told me later. Aunt June is Rose's younger sister, 81, 5 feet nothing, drinks brandy in her coffee and does not lie. Aunt June told me that in the fall of 2020, 6 months before Rose died, Diane brought a man to the house with a folder and tried to get Rose to sign a new deed and comments of groat, a family planning tool, she called it, something about Medicaid protection, something about being practical. Rose was 90% there that day. She read 2 pages of it, put it down on the kitchen table, and said, "Diane, I have known you since you were 22 years old, and you have never once wanted anything for a reason you said out loud." And then she called Harlan Boyd the next morning and had her will re-executed with the house going to Eli by name. Diane knew about that meeting. Diane knew she'd been beaten by an 87-year-old woman with a rotary phone. She waited 4 years. Okay. My job. This is going to matter enormously, so give me 90 seconds. I'm a title examiner at a company called Northgate Title and Abstract. When somebody in our county buys a house or refinances or inherits property, somebody has to go into the public record and trace the ownership of that piece of dirt backward through time, every sale, every mortgage, every lien, every easement, every death, every divorce, and make sure the chain is unbroken and the person selling it actually owns it. That somebody is me. I spend my days in county recorders' offices and on the state's online records portal, reading deeds, warranty deeds, quitclaim deeds, mortgage discharges, probate filings. I read the handwriting of clerks who died before World War II. I've caught forged signatures 3 times in 11 years. I found a 1962 easement that killed a $400,000 deal on the day of closing. I know what a properly executed conveyance looks like. I know what a notary block is supposed to contain. I know, off the top of my head, what the recording fee is in 5 counties. Diane thought I did something with paperwork at the courthouse. She thought it was steady. She was about to find out exactly how steady I am. I have to tell you about October, and I'm going to tell it quickly because I've told it enough times now that I can get through it, but I don't like to linger. On October 3rd, 2024, at 11 weeks and 2 days, I lost a pregnancy. We had wanted it for a long time. 4 years, 2 rounds of medication, 1 procedure. We had a room at the back of the house that faced the water, the one with the best morning light, and Eli had already stripped the wallpaper in it in August because he couldn't help himself. He said he was just prepping. He wasn't just prepping. He'd bought a piece of curly maple and hidden it in the boat shop, and I knew exactly what he was going to make out of it. We told 2 people, my sister, Hala, in Duluth, and Diane. We told Diane because she called on a Tuesday night when I was 5 days out, and I couldn't hold my voice together, and Eli took the phone into the yard and came back 20 minutes later with red eyes. And Diane was, I want to be fair here, Diane was for about 9 days genuinely kind. She brought soup. She sat with me on the porch and didn't fill the silence. She told me about a loss she'd had in 1988 between Grant and Allie that I had never known about. She held my hand. I cried in front of her, which I had never done. I have thought about those 9 days more than almost anything else in this story. Because on October 16th, 13 days after I lost the baby, Eli went into the emergency room at Munson Medical Center at 2 a.m. with an appendix that had already started to go. They took it out at 6:40 a.m. on the 16th. He was inpatient through the 18th because of the complication. And on October 17th, while my husband was in a hospital bed on a morphine pump with a drain in his side, a document was signed with his name on it. I quit claim deed, transferring all right title and interest in the Cormorant house from Ella's R. Vance to Diane M. Vance. Notarized, witnessed, recorded 4 days later at the Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds for a $30 fee. I didn't know that yet. Nobody knew that yet. Diane had sat on my porch and held my hand while I cried about a baby, and then she'd waited for the exact week we were both flat on our backs, and she'd moved. That's the part that still gets me at 2 in the morning sometimes. The soup was real. I've decided that. The soup was real, and it didn't matter at all, and I don't know which of those two facts is worse. Christmas that year was at Diane's. It was always at Diane's. She had a big center entrance colonial on Fairmount Street in town, 4 bedrooms, a dining room she'd added on in 2009, specifically so she could seat 16, and a set of china that came out twice a year and got mentioned 4 times an hour. I want to describe the day, because I need you to feel the room. December 25th, 2024. It had snowed 11 inches on the 23rd and then gone bitter clear, the way it does up there, that hard blue afternoon light coming off the drifts. Eli and I drove in from Bell Harbor at 3:30 with a car full of gifts and a cheesecake I'd made at 6 that morning because Diane had assigned me dessert in a text message that said, "You'll bring something sweet, nothing too rich?" The house smelled like a prime rib and cloves and the particular smell of a woman who irons her tablecloth. 14 people plus us. Let me walk you through the table because you're going to want to know who was in the room. At the head, Diane, cream cashmere pearls, hair set that morning at the place on Union Street. To her right, Grant. Eli's older brother, 39, owns a power sports dealership out on M72 that sells snowmobiles and side-by-sides and had, I would learn later, been in serious trouble for about 2 years. Grant is loud in a way that is designed to prevent conversation. Grant's wife, Paige, 37, manages a dental office, and in 9 years I had never had a real conversation with her that wasn't about the weather. She always looked at me like she was deciding something. Their 2 kids, Mika, 9, and Josie, 6. Aunt June, 81, at the far end where she always sat, because she liked to be near the door. Diane's brother Ray and his wife, Kathy, up from Grand Rapids. Ray's grown son, Colby, and his girlfriend. Diane's oldest friend, Marlene Ostrander, and her husband, Doug. Marlene Ostrander, write that name down too. And a man I had met exactly twice, Warren Ash, 68, silver blazer with a pocket square, a laugh like a car door closing. Diane introduced him at Thanksgiving as my friend Warren. He'd brought her a poinsettia the size of a bush and touched the small of her back when she passed behind his chair, and Eli had watched that happen and said nothing about it in the car. Warren Ash sat 3 seats from me, and he ate a full plate of my cheesecake, and he had known since November what was in that box. We ate at 5. It was a good dinner. It's important to me that you know it was a good dinner, that Diane laughed twice at something. Aunt June said that Josie spilled cranberry sauce and nobody made a thing of it, that for about 70 minutes it was just a family at Christmas. Around 6:15, Diane stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. I remember thinking, here it comes, because she always made a speech, every year. 2 minutes about the year we'd had, 1 line about Gordon, who died in 2016, and a little toast that ended with, "And to Rose's house, still standing." Every year. And to Rose's house, still standing. She did the speech, she did the line about Gordon. Ray got misty, and then she said, "Before pie, I have one more gift, and it isn't under the tree." And she went into the kitchen and came back with a silver box with a red velvet ribbon on it, and she set it down in front of me. Everybody clapped a little. That soft, polite dinner table clap. Paige leaned forward. Micah, 9 years old, said, "Open it, open it." I looked at Eli. Eli shrugged and grinned at me. He had no idea. I need you to know that. My husband had absolutely no idea. I untied the ribbon. Inside, on white tissue paper, there were 2 brass keys on a paper tag. The tag said in Diane's handwriting, Unit 4B, Lakeview Commons, and under the keys, folded into thirds, was a document, cream paper, a logo at the top with a bird on it, Kestrel Ridge Holdings, LC Purchase Agreement. I read the first paragraph. Then I read the property description, and the property description was 414 Bell Harbor Road, and it was our house, and the closing date was January 15th, 2025, and the seller's signature line said Diane Emma Vance, and it was already signed, and it had been signed on December 9th, 16 days before she handed it to me. The room was quiet. I could hear the furnace running. I looked up, and Diane was standing there with her hands folded in front of her, and she was smiling, and her eyes were absolutely flat. "Now," she said, in the voice she used to use on 8th graders, before anybody gets emotional. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to be a mistake or a misunderstanding or something we'd untangle over coffee. That was a woman standing in front of a firing squad she had assembled herself, and she was giving the order. I'm going to give you her speech almost word for word because I have replayed it approximately 4,000 times, and also because, and we'll get to this, somebody in that room recorded it. She said, "Rose's house is too much for the two of you. It just is. And I know you've both worked very hard on it, and everyone at this table has heard about that work." That little laugh, and Grant laughed with her, but the roof alone is going to be $40,000 in the next 2 years, and the seawall is failing, and neither of you has that. I've watched you pour money into that place for 4 years, and I've said nothing. I said, "Mom, what is this?" She kept going. She never once looked at him. "Warren's group is putting together the parcels on that stretch of Bell Harbor, and they've made an extremely generous offer. Well above market. They'll take it as is. There's no inspection contingency, no repairs, nothing for you to do." Warren Ash smiled at his plate. "Lakeview Commons is brand new, 2 bedrooms, in-unit laundry, and it's 5 minutes from town, so you're not out there on that road in February. I've paid the deposit and the first 3 months. That's my gift, and honestly—" And here she paused, and she did something with her face that I can only describe as softening, and she looked at me for the first time, and her voice went warm and gentle, and she said, "Honestly, sweetheart, it's not as though you'll be needing 3 bedrooms now." I want to describe what happened in my body. The sound went out of the room, not metaphorically. My hearing did something. I could see Paige's mouth open. I could see Aunt June's hand go flat on the tablecloth. Kathy said, "Oh," 1 syllable, and put her napkin up. Micah, 9 years old, said, "Why won't they need 3 bedrooms?" And Diane said to a 9-year-old at a Christmas table, "Because Aunt Maren lost the baby, sweetheart. It's very sad. Eat your potatoes." There were 4 people at that table who hadn't known. Ray, Kathy, Colby, Marlene. She told them. She told them like it was a weather report, and she did it inside the same sentence where she took my house, so that if I made any sound at all, I would be the woman who caused a scene at Christmas over a generous gift in front of the children. That's what the audience was for. That was the whole architecture of it. She didn't bring 14 witnesses so they could celebrate with her. She brought 14 witnesses so that I would be polite. And here's the thing I want you to know, and it took me a year and a very good therapist to be able to say it without shame. For about 11 seconds, it worked. I sat there. I put the paper down. I said, "Thank you." I said, "Thank you." And then I looked at my husband, and my husband, the man who rebuilt the porch of that house with his own 2 hands, who cried in a hospital gown about a baby, who I have loved since a bonfire in 2015, my husband looked down at his plate and said, "Let's not do this here. Let's not do this here." 4 words. Out of everything that happened that night, out of everything Diane said and did, those are the 4 words that I had to work hardest to forgive. Because in that second I was alone in that room. I stood up. I remember the chair legs on the floor being very loud. I said, "Excuse me," and I walked down the hall past the framed school photos of Grant and Eli and Gordon's Rotary plaque, and I got my coat off the bed in the guest room, and I stood there for a second in the dark holding a wool coat and shaking. Aunt June came in behind me, 81 years old, moving fast. She shut the door, and she said in a low, absolutely steady voice, "Maren, look at me. Rose left that house to Ellis. I sat in Harlan Boyd's office, and I watched her sign it. Whatever Diane says she has, she doesn't have it." And I said, "She's already signed a purchase agreement, June. You can't sell what you don't own. It wouldn't even get past the title search. It would die on day 1. And June said, "Then how did it get to day 16? I stopped shaking. Because she was right. That was the whole question, and I had missed it because I was busy being humiliated. Purchase agreement signed on December 9th. A title company somewhere had opened a file. A closing date set for January 15th. Warren Ash was a developer. He'd done this 100 times. He was not going to sign a purchase agreement with a woman who wasn't on the deed, which meant somebody somewhere had already pulled the record on 4LM14 Bell Harbor Road. And somebody had looked at that record and seen Diane M. Vance. I put my coat on. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I walked out the front door into 11 degrees, and I sat in the truck with the engine off for 4 minutes, and then Eli came out. He got in. He didn't start the truck either. He said, "She's confused. Mom gets ideas. Grandma's estate was complicated. There were papers, she probably thinks." And I said, "Eli, take out your phone, right now, in this driveway." He said, "Marin," I said, "take out your phone and open the Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds. I'll tell you where to click." He did. It took 90 seconds. And I watched my husband's face go the color of the snow on the hood of the truck, and he turned the screen toward me, and there it was. Instrument 2024-033817, Quit Claim Deed, recorded 10/1/24, Grantor Ellis R. Vance, Grantee Diane M. Vance. He said, I didn't." And I said, "I know you didn't. You were in Munson with a drain in your side." He said, "Then what is that?" And I said the sentence that I think about every time I tell this story, because it was the moment I stopped being a woman who'd been humiliated at a dinner table and became something considerably more useful. I said, "That's a felony, Eli," and she recorded it herself, in public, under her own name, with a receipt. We drove home in silence for 6 miles. Bell Harbor Road at night in late December is a tunnel, snow-banked 8 feet on both sides where the plow's been through, cedar trees leaning in over the top, and every quarter-mile a gap where you can see out onto the bay, and the bay was frozen out about 200 yards and black past that. I said, "Twice. There has to be an explanation." The second time, I said, "There is. I just gave it to you." We pulled in. Our porch light was on because we'd left it on. The house looked exactly the way it always looked, and I remember standing in the driveway with my keys in my hand and having the most disorienting feeling of my life, which was, this is not mine anymore, and it hasn't been mine since October, and I've been living inside somebody else's transaction for 10 weeks, and I didn't know. I'd hung new curtains in the front room on November 2nd. I'd bought them on sale. Inside, Eli sat on the stairs with his coat still on for about 20 minutes. I didn't say anything to him. I went into the kitchen and I did what I do, which is that I got a legal pad. I wrote down everything I knew in order with dates. That's the job. When a chain of title is broken, you don't panic, you don't argue, you don't feel. You build the chain forward from the last known good link and you find exactly where it breaks. Last known good link, March 2021. Rose's will probated, personal representative's deed to Ellis R. Vance, clean, recorded. I'd literally pulled it myself when we refinanced in 2022. Break, October 21st, 2024. A quitclaim deed out of Ellis to Diane. And in between, nothing, no sale, no consideration, no reason on earth. Then I wrote a second list, and the second list was the one that mattered. 1. Who notarized it? 2. Where was Eli on the date of execution? 3. Who prepared it? 4. Who ordered the title search for Kestrel Ridge and when? 5. Why now? That fifth question, I underlined it twice. Because here's what didn't add up, and it bothered me all night. Diane had wanted that house for 30 years. She'd tried once in 2020 and failed. If it was about wanting the house, about pride, about control, about being the one who holds the key, then she'd have taken the deed and sat on it. She'd have held it over us for a decade. That's her whole personality. That's the exact shape of the woman. She didn't do that. She took the deed in October and had it under a purchase agreement by December 9th. 7 weeks. She wasn't taking the house. She was liquidating it, which meant Diane Vance needed money, fast, and badly. And when I wrote that sentence on the legal pad at 11:40 on Christmas night in a house I no longer legally owned, I felt something come back into my chest that I hadn't felt in about 6 hours. I'll tell you what it was, and it isn't pretty, but it's honest. It was appetite. At midnight, I walked down the hall and stood outside the back bedroom, the one with the morning light. The door had been shut since October 3rd. Neither of us had opened it, and neither of us had talked about not opening it. I put my hand flat on that door, and I said, out loud, to a room with stripped wallpaper and a piece of curly maple hidden in a boat shop 3 miles away, "She's not getting this house." And then I went to bed and slept 4 hours and got up at 5 and drove into town because the Register of Deeds opens at 8 and I have never in my life needed a public records office more than I needed one on the 26th of December. The Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds is on the second floor of the Governmental Center on Boardman Avenue, and I've been going in there twice a week for 11 years, and the woman at the counter is named Paulette, and Paulette has a picture of a beagle taped to her monitor. Paulette said, "Merry Christmas, Ann. You're in early. Big closing?" And I said something like that. I want to be very clear about something because people ask me this. I did not use any special access. I did not pull strings. Everything I looked at that morning is available to any human being who walks into that building with $4 and a photo ID. That's the entire point of a public record. That is why it's public. I pulled the certified copy of Instrument 2024, SIL 33817. And I sat down at the long oak table by the window with the winter light coming in, and I read it the way I've read maybe 40,000 documents, and here is what it told me. 1. It was a Michigan statutory quitclaim deed, standard form, the kind you can download in 9 seconds, no attorney's name in the drafted by block. Instead, in the space where a preparer goes, somebody had typed prepared by grantee, which is legal. It's also the flag you never want to see, because it means no professional put their license anywhere near it. 2. The consideration was listed as $1, $1 and other good and valuable consideration. Nobody gives away a lakefront house on Grand Traverse Bay for $1. That's not illegal. Family transfers happen at $1 all the time, but combined with everything else it screamed. 3. The signature. It was Ellie's signature. It was good. I've seen his signature on maybe 1,000 things, mortgage documents, checks, our marriage license, the back of a boat title. Whoever wrote that had practiced. The E was right. The loop on the double L was right. But my husband is left-handed, and he drags the heel of his hand, and every signature he's ever produced has a small smear at the end of the final stroke, and this one was clean as a bell. 4. And this is the one that ended it. The notary block. State of Michigan, County of Grand Traverse. Subscribed and sworn before me the 17th day of October, 2024. Notary Public, Marlene J. Ostrander. Commission expires 04/2027. Acting in the County of Grand Traverse, Marlene Ostrander. Diane's oldest friend. Bridge partner of 19 years. Sat at the Christmas table 2 seats down from me and ate my cheesecake and heard Diane announce the sale of a house and said nothing because she had personally notarized the theft of it 9 weeks earlier. And there was one more thing about Marlene Ostrander that I knew, and it took my breath out. Marlene Ostrander was the office manager at Grant Vance's dealership on M72. Diane's son, Ely's brother. I sat in that beautiful old room with the radiator ticking and the certified copy in my hands, and I did the thing you do in my job, which is that I said the sentence out loud to make sure it was true. A notary swore, under her commission, that Ellis Vance personally appeared before her on October 17th. And on October 17th, Ellis Vance was in room 4012 of Munson Medical Center, 30 hours post-op, on a dilaudid pump with a surgical drain in his abdomen, being monitored for post-operative ileus. We had discharge paperwork, we had a wristband in a drawer because Eli keeps things, we had my parking receipts, we had my mother-in-law's own text message from October 17th at 9:12 a.m. that said, "How is he this morning? Don't let them rush the discharge." She texted me from the crime. Quick word here, because this became the spine of everything. A notary public is not a formality. When Marlene Ostrander signed and stamped that notary block, she was making a sworn certification, under the authority of the state of Michigan, that a specific human being physically appeared in front of her, that she confirmed his identity, and that he acknowledged signing that document, voluntarily. If that didn't happen, that's not sloppiness. That's a false certificate. Under Michigan law, that's a felony, and forging a signature on a deed and then recording it with the county is another one, and recording a false instrument affecting real property is another one on top of that. Diane, a woman who ran a middle school for 29 years and never got a parking ticket, had committed a stack of felonies that a first-year law student could identify from across a room. And she'd done it in the most permanent, most public, most documented way available to a citizen of the United States. She'd walked into a government building, handed a clerk $30, and asked them to make a permanent record of it. You know why? Because it never once occurred to Diane Vance that anyone would check. Nobody had ever checked her, not in 63 years, not the school board, not the garden society, not her husband, not her sons. She said a thing, and the thing became true because she was Diane and you were not. She looked at the county recorder's office, the way she looked at every institution in her life, as a place that would file what she gave it and never ask. She was right about that, actually. The county doesn't verify. The Register of Deeds is a filing cabinet, not a judge. It records what you bring in. But everything that goes in that filing cabinet has a date, a fee receipt, a scan of the original, and the name of the human being who walked it in. And I read that filing cabinet for a living. I got home at 11 that morning with 3 certified copies and a printout of Marlene Ostrander's notary commission from the Secretary of State's public database. Eli was in the kitchen. He hadn't shaved. There was a full pot of coffee and 1 clean mug that he hadn't used. I laid it out on the table in order, like I was walking a client through a title opinion, because that was the only way I could do it without crying. The deed, the signature, the date, the notary, the hospital band from the drawer. Eli looked at the signature for a long time. He said quietly, "That's my name." I said, "It is." He said, "That's not my hand, but that's my name. Somebody sat down and practiced my name." And then my husband, who is a large, calm man who fixes boats, put both hands flat on the table and started to cry in a way I have seen exactly twice, and the other time was in October. He said, "Why would she do this to me?" Not to us, to me. And I let him have that because it was true, and because there is a specific kind of grief that belongs to a person who finds out that their mother is a stranger, and I had no standing in it. I made him eat something. Then I said, "I need you to do one thing today, and it's going to be hard." He said, "Call her." I said, "No, do not call her. That's the one thing you can't do." He said, "Maren, she's my mother. I'm not going to." And I said, "Eli, listen to me as a professional. Right now, she thinks the deed is clean. She thinks the closing happens on the 15th. If you call her today, you tell her exactly what we know, and she gets 3 weeks to build a story. She's smart. She'll say you signed it in September and she post-dated it. She'll say she has a power of attorney. She'll find one, at least she'll get somebody to backdate a POA, and then it's your word against a notarized document, and juries like notarized documents." He said, "So what do we do?" And I said, "We do it in the right order. Lawyer first, then evidence, then we take it to somebody with a badge, and we don't say one word to that woman until we can put the whole thing on a table at once." He said, "For how long?" I said, 10 days. And he said, "And this was the moment I knew we were going to survive this." He said, "Okay, 10 days. Then he picked up his phone and turned it off and put it in a drawer because he knew himself. And he knew that if she called him at 10 at night and cried, he would answer. 26 hours later, my phone rang at 7:40 in the morning, and it was a number I didn't know, and I almost didn't pick up. It was Paige Vance, my sister-in-law of 9 years, the woman I had never had a real conversation with. She said, "Are you alone?" I said, "I'm in my kitchen. Eli's at the boatyard." She said, "I'm in the Midra parking lot in Acme because I don't want to have this conversation in my own house. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I said, "Yes." And Paige Vance said, "Grant's dealership hasn't made money since 2022. He owes about $400,000, and about 110 of it is money he took out of the floor plan financing, which, Moran, that's not a bank loan. That's inventory he doesn't own. He sold units he didn't own. That's not bankruptcy. That's the other thing." I sat down on the kitchen floor. She said, "Diane has been covering him since 20 or 23. She cashed out her retirement in March. She took a home equity line on Fairmount Street in June. She's got nothing left. In September, the finance company gave Grant 60 days before they audit the lot." She said, "In September," and I did the arithmetic out loud, and my voice sounded far away. 60 days from September was the middle of November, which meant Diane needed a large amount of money before the middle of November, or her golden son, the loud one, the one who sat at her right hand, was going to be looked at by people who asked questions for a living. And the largest asset within her reach, the one thing in the world she could get her hands on, was a lakefront parcel on Bell Harbor Road that a development company had been sniffing at for 2 years. She didn't take my house because she wanted my house. She took my house because she needed to feed it to a fire. I said, "Paige, why are you telling me this?" And she was quiet for a while, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "Because on Christmas she used your dead baby as a closing argument in front of my 9-year-old, and I've been sitting in that family for 11 years telling myself she's just difficult." Then she said, "There's something else. On Christmas Eve, Grant and Diane and Warren were in the den for about 40 minutes with the door shut. I went to bring in coffee. I heard maybe 2 minutes of it." I said, "What did you hear?" She said, "I heard Warren say the title work came back on the 12th and it's clean, so as long as nobody pulls a fresh search, we're fine through closing." As long as nobody pulls a fresh search. I said, "Paige, I have to ask you something, and it's a lie. Would you say that to an investigator?" And she said, "I already wrote it down. I wrote it down that night with the date on it because I'm not an idiot and because I've been waiting 4 years for somebody in this family to do something." December 28th, I drove out to Aunt June's, which is a little ranch house behind the Lutheran church with about 9 bird feeders in the yard. She had the coffee on. She had brandy in hers at 10 in the morning and offered me some, and I said no, and she said, "Suit yourself," in a tone that suggested I was making an error. I told her everything, the deed, the hospital, Marlene, Grant's dealership. June listened with her hands around the mug, and when I was done, she got up and went into the back bedroom and came back with a stride-right shoebox. She said, "Rose gave me this in February of 2021, 3 weeks before she died. She said, 'June, hold on to this, and if Diane ever makes trouble about the house, give it to Ellis's wife.'" I said, "To me?" She said, "Me?" June said, she said, "The one who fixes things. You'd redone her back steps that fall," she noticed. In the box, the original signed will, the executed 2021 deed to Eli, Harlan Boyd's card, and an envelope with Ellis written on it in Rose's shaky hand. June said, "That last one's not for you and it's not for me. That's his." I brought it home, and Eli read it on the porch in the cold with his coat on and stayed out there for 40 minutes. He never told me all of what was in it. He told me one part, and I asked if I could use it, and he said yes. Rose had written, "Your mother will tell you the house should have been hers. She will be very reasonable about it. She is always very reasonable. I want you to understand that I am not punishing her. I am protecting a house from a person who has never once in her life wanted a thing for the reason she gave. If she comes for it, do not argue with her. She wins arguments. Show her paper instead. She has never known what to do about paper." An 88-year-old woman, dead 3.5 years, reached out of a shoebox and handed me the strategy. Show her paper instead? That's exactly what we did. December 30th, we sat across a desk from an attorney named Ingrid Sokolov in an office above a bakery in Traverse City. Ingrid is about 5'2", 60-ish, does real estate litigation and elder financial abuse, and speaks in the shortest sentences of any human being I have ever met. She read the deed, she read the discharge summary, she looked at the notary printout. It took her 9 minutes. Then she took off her glasses and said, "This is the cleanest case I've seen in 4 years. I said, "Really?" She said, "Void deeds are usually messy. Somebody's got dementia, somebody's got a PO, everybody's lying. This isn't that. Your husband was in a hospital bed. A notary swore he was in her office. Those cannot both be true. The whole thing collapses on one date." She laid out the plan in about 6 minutes. 1. File a list pendens immediately. That's a notice recorded with the county that says this property is the subject of active litigation. Once that's on the record, no title company on earth will ensure that closing. Kestrel Ridge's lender would run. The January 15th closing would die where it stood. 2. File a quiet title action to void the October deed and confirm Ally as owner. 3. Report it. Not as a threat, as a fact. Deed forgery and false notarization go to the county prosecutor's office. Ingrid knew an investigator there named Dana Pruitt who did financial crime. 4. File a complaint with the Michigan Department of State against Marlene Ostrander's notary commission with the hospital records attached. I said, "How fast can you do the list pendens?" Ingrid looked at the calendar. She said, 2nd of January, first business day. And then she said the thing that changed the shape of everything, and it wasn't legal advice, it was something else. She said, "Can I tell you what usually happens in these cases? The family finds out, and they don't want the scandal, so they beg the victim to keep it in the family. And the victim does. And then 5 years later, the same woman does it to somebody else." She said, "You're going to get a lot of pressure to be gracious from people who love you. Decide now what you're going to do, because you won't be able to decide in the moment." I drove home, and I decided. And on January 2nd at 9:15 in the morning, Ingrid Sokolov's paralegal walked into the Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds, the same counter, the same Paulette, the same beagle on the monitor, and recorded a notice of pending litigation against 41140 Bell Harbor Road. And 31 hours later, Diane found out. January 3rd, 4220 in the afternoon. Eli's phone had been off in a drawer for 8 days. Mine hadn't, because somebody had to be reachable. It started with Grant, 6 calls in 40 minutes, then a text, "Call me, now, before you do something you can't undo." And I did the arithmetic out loud, and my voice sounded far away. 60 days from September was the middle of November, which meant Diane needed a large amount of money before the middle of November, or her golden son, the loud one, the one who sat at her right hand, was going to be looked at by people who asked questions for a living. And the largest asset within her reach, the one thing in the world she could get her hands on, was a lakefront parcel on Bell Harbor Road that a development company had been sniffing at for 2 years. She didn't take my house because she wanted my house. She took my house because she needed to feed it to a fire. I said, "Paige, why are you telling me this?" And she was quiet for a while, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "Because on Christmas she used your dead baby as a closing argument in front of my 9-year-old, and I've been sitting in that family for 11 years telling myself she's just difficult." Then she said, "There's something else. On Christmas Eve, Grant and Diane and Warren were in the den for about 40 minutes with the door shut. I went to bring in coffee. I heard maybe 2 minutes of it." I said, "What did you hear?" She said, "I heard Warren say the title work came back on the 12th and it's clean, so as long as nobody pulls a fresh search, we're fine through closing." As long as nobody pulls a fresh search. I said, "Paige, I have to ask you something, and it's a lie. Would you say that to an investigator?" And she said, "I already wrote it down. I wrote it down that night with the date on it because I'm not an idiot and because I've been waiting 4 years for somebody in this family to do something." December 28th, I drove out to Aunt June's, which is a little ranch house behind the Lutheran church with about 9 bird feeders in the yard. She had the coffee on. She had brandy in hers at 10 in the morning and offered me some, and I said no, and she said, "Suit yourself," in a tone that suggested I was making an error. I told her everything, the deed, the hospital, Marlene, Grant's dealership. June listened with her hands around the mug, and when I was done, she got up and went into the back bedroom and came back with a stride-right shoebox. She said, "Rose gave me this in February of 2021, 3 weeks before she died. She said, 'June, hold on to this, and if Diane ever makes trouble about the house, give it to Ellis's wife.'" I said, "To me?" She said, "Me?" June said, she said, "The one who fixes things. You'd redone her back steps that fall," she noticed. In the box, the original signed will, the executed 2021 deed to Eli, Harlan Boyd's card, and an envelope with Ellis written on it in Rose's shaky hand. June said, "That last one's not for you and it's not for me. That's his." I brought it home, and Eli read it on the porch in the cold with his coat on and stayed out there for 40 minutes. He never told me all of what was in it. He told me one part, and I asked if I could use it, and he said yes. Rose had written, "Your mother will tell you the house should have been hers. She will be very reasonable about it. She is always very reasonable. I want you to understand that I am not punishing her. I am protecting a house from a person who has never once in her life wanted a thing for the reason she gave. If she comes for it, do not argue with her. She wins arguments. Show her paper instead. She has never known what to do about paper." An 88-year-old woman, dead 3.5 years, reached out of a shoebox and handed me the strategy. Show her paper instead? That's exactly what we did. December 30th, we sat across a desk from an attorney named Ingrid Sokolov in an office above a bakery in Traverse City. Ingrid is about 5'2", 60-ish, does real estate litigation and elder financial abuse, and speaks in the shortest sentences of any human being I have ever met. She read the deed, she read the discharge summary, she looked at the notary printout. It took her 9 minutes. Then she took off her glasses and said, "This is the cleanest case I've seen in 4 years." I said, "Really?" She said, "Void deeds are usually messy. Somebody's got dementia, somebody's got a PO, everybody's lying. This isn't that. Your husband was in a hospital bed. A notary swore he was in her office. Those cannot both be true. The whole thing collapses on one date." She laid out the plan in about 6 minutes. 1. File a lis pendens immediately. That's a notice, recorded with the county, that says this property is the subject of active litigation. Once that's on the record, no title company on earth will ensure that closing. Kestrel Ridge's lender would run. The January 15th closing would die where it stood. 2. File a quiet title action to void the October deed and confirm Ally as owner. 3. Report it. Not as a threat, as a fact. Deed forgery and false notarization go to the county prosecutor's office. Ingrid knew an investigator there named Dana Pruitt who did financial crime. 4. File a complaint with the Michigan Department of State against Marlene Ostrander's notary commission, with the hospital records attached. I said, "How fast can you do the lis pendens?" Ingrid looked at the calendar. She said, 2nd of January, first business day. And then she said the thing that changed the shape of everything, and it wasn't legal advice, it was something else. She said, "Can I tell you what usually happens in these cases? The family finds out, and they don't want the scandal, so they beg the victim to keep it in the family. And the victim does. And then 5 years later, the same woman does it to somebody else." She said, "You're going to get a lot of pressure to be gracious from people who love you. Decide now what you're going to do, because you won't be able to decide in the moment." I drove home, and I decided. And on January 2nd at 9:15 in the morning, Ingrid Sokolov's paralegal walked into the Grand Traverse County Register of Deeds, the same counter, the same Paulette, the same beagle on the monitor, and recorded a notice of pending litigation against 41140 Bell Harbor Road. And 31 hours later, Diane found out. January 3rd, 4220 in the afternoon. Eli's phone had been off in a drawer for 8 days. Mine hadn't, because somebody had to be reachable. It started with Grant, 6 calls in 40 minutes, then a text, "Call me, now, before you do something you can't undo." I need you to understand that. Diane Vance, who never made a mistake, who had run a school and a garden society and a family with total control for 4 decades, put her phone in her purse without locking it, and her purse called her son, and her son's voicemail recorded 131 seconds of her kitchen. Eli played it for me sitting on the edge of the bed at 1:41 in the morning. The first 40 seconds is nothing. Dishes, a chair, Warren Ash saying something about the road. Then Diane, off mic, clear as anything. "He'll come around. He always comes around. He'll be angry for 3 weeks, and then he'll need something." Warren says something about the wife. And Diane says, "She's the problem. She was always going to be the problem. She's got that little job, and she thinks it makes her important." Then Warren asks, and I could hear him smiling. You can hear a smile. He asks whether she thinks Marin will make trouble. And Diane Vance said, "No, she hasn't got it in her. She sat right there at my table and said thank you." And then she left, and then she said the sentence that ended her. She said, "Warren, honestly, the timing was a gift. If she hadn't lost that baby, I'd have had a real fight on my hands. God works in mysterious ways." 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Eli sat there with the phone in his hand, and his shoulders were shaking, and he wasn't making any noise at all. And after a while he said, in a completely flat voice, "Send it to Ingrid." I said, "Eli." He said, "Send it to Ingrid and send it to that investigator and tell them everything, all of it. Grant too." I said, "Are you sure? Because tomorrow you can't take this back." And my husband looked up at me and he said, "She said the timing was a gift." That was all he said. That was the whole thing. At 6:15 that morning, I forwarded a voicemail to a lawyer. And at 9:00 a.m. on January 3rd, Diane sent a group text to 11 people announcing a family meeting to clear the air at the Cormorant House our house, which she still believed was hers, on Saturday, January 4th at 2 in the afternoon. She scheduled her own ending. She catered it too. She brought a coffee cake. They came. Diane in the good coat, Warren Ash in the blazer with a leather portfolio, Grant, Ray, and Kathy, Marlene Ostrander and Doug, Aunt June, who I had personally driven there and installed in the wing chair by the fireplace with a cup of coffee, and Paige, who arrived alone without her husband and sat down next to June, which Grant noticed. 11 people in the front room of a 1937 lake cottage with a fire going, because I built a fire. I want you to know I built a fire. If a woman is going to try to take your house in your own living room, the room should be warm. Diane walked in and looked around at the room the way she always did, that quick, appraising principal sweep, and then she stood in front of the fireplace, which is where she was always going to stand, and she began. I want to say first that I love every person in this room. She talked for 6 minutes. It was, I'll admit, extremely good. She talked about Rose's decline, about how papers were signed at that time that nobody fully understood, about how she'd only ever tried to protect her son from a money pit, about how she was willing to step back entirely if we would simply withdraw the filing. She never once said lis pendens, she said the filing, because it was hurting people who have nothing to do with this. And then she turned to Eli and said, Ellis, I'm your mother. Look at me and tell me you think I'm a criminal. Perfect. Structurally perfect. Ends on a question he can't answer in front of 11 people. And Eli looked at her and he said, Marin's going to talk. Diane's face changed for about a quarter of a second. Then it reset. She said warmly, Of course, Marin dear. I stood up, and I did not make a speech because I am not good at speeches, and because Rose Vance had already told me what to do. Show her paper instead. I had a folder. I put it on the coffee table, and I opened it, and I did it the way I do a title opinion for a client, which is out loud, in order, one document at a time. Document 1. I put down the 2021 Personal Representative's Deed, March 2021. Rose Vance's estate conveys 40114 Bell Harbor Road to Ellis R. Vance, probated, recorded, uncontested for 3 years and 7 months. Aunt June witnessed the execution of the will. Harlan Boyd drafted it, and he's alive, and he's in Petoskey. June said, from the wing chair, I'm alive too, Diane. Document 2. I put down the certified copy of the quitclaim October 21st, 2024, a quitclaim deed conveying that same property from Ellis to Diane, prepared by grantee, consideration of $1. Ray said, $1? And Kathy put a hand on his arm. Document 3. I put down the notary block, blown up on an 11 by 17 notarized by Marlene J. Ostrander, who certified under her commission that Ellis Vance personally appeared in front of her on October the 17th. I looked at Marlene. Marlene was looking at the carpet, and her husband Doug was looking at his wife with an expression I hope I never see on anyone's face again. Document 4. The discharge summary from Munson. 2 pages. Timestamps. The surgeon's name. On October 16th at 6:40 in the morning, Ellis had an emergency appendectomy. He was admitted through the 18th. On October 17th, the day he supposedly walked into Marlene's office and signed a deed, he was on IV narcotics on the 4th floor of Munson Medical Center, and he did not stand up unassisted until that evening. Document 5. I put down a printed screenshot. October 17th, 9:12 a.m. text message from Diane Vance to me. How is he this morning? Don't let them rush the discharge. The room went very still. Grant said, that doesn't prove. I said, Grant, she's asking me how he's doing in the hospital at 9 in the morning on the same day and in the same county where a notary says he was standing in an office signing a deed. One of those 2 things is a lie, and only one of them is a felony. Document 6. The purchase agreement, the one from the silver box with the red ribbon, signed by Diane Vance on December 9th, 2024, with Kestrel Ridge Holdings. Warren, that's your company. Your title order went out on December 10th and came back on the 12th. Warren Ash said, I'd like to consult my attorney before. I said, that's a good idea. Document 7. And this was the one I'd hesitated over, and Ingrid had said use it, and Paige had said use it, and Eli had said use it. I set my phone on the coffee table. I said, December 27th, 2-minute voicemail, accidental call from Diane's phone to Ellie's. Nobody recorded her. She recorded herself. And I pressed play, and a room of 11 people in a warm house on a frozen bay listened to Diane Vance say, she's got that little job and she thinks it makes her important. And then she sat right there at my table and said thank you. And then the laugh. And then the timing was a gift. If she hadn't lost that baby, I'd have had a real fight on my hands. Nobody moved. Kathy started to cry. Ray stood up and walked out of the room and out the front door without his coat and stood in our driveway in 11 degrees for about 10 minutes. Marlene Ostrander said to nobody, Diane, you told me he'd signed it at home. You told me he'd signed it at home and you were just bringing in. And Doug said, Marlene, don't say another word. We're leaving. Grant said, you edited that. Paige said without looking up, she said it in the den on Christmas Eve too. I wrote it down. And Grant turned and looked at his wife, and his wife looked back at him, and 11 years of something ended right there in front of everybody. Diane Vance stood in front of my fireplace through all of it. She never sat down. I'll give her that. She stood there with her hands folded and her chin level, and she let the whole thing happen to her. And when it was over, she looked around the room. And she saw it. I watched her see it. She was a woman who had never once in her life been in a room that wasn't hers. And she said, well, she picked up her purse. She got as far as the doorway, and then she turned around, and she looked at me, and she said the last thing she ever said to me in person. She said, Rose would be ashamed of you. And I said, and I have never been prouder of anything I've said in my life because it came out completely calm. Rose left me a letter, Diane. She stopped. I said, it's addressed to Eli, but she told June to make sure I got the box. Do you want to know what she wrote? Diane didn't answer. I said, she wrote, show her paper instead. She's never known what to do about paper. Diane Vance stood in the doorway of the house she had wanted for 30 years, and for the first time since I'd known her, she had absolutely nothing to say. She walked out. Warren Ash followed her with his portfolio. And Aunt June, 81 years old, in the wing chair, raised her coffee cup about 4 inches and said to the room, Rose, I know how these stories usually end. Somebody goes to prison for 20 years and the family cheered. That's not what happened, and I think the truth is better, because the truth is what's actually available to people like us. Here's how it went. The closing died on January 6th. Kestrel Ridge's title underwriter saw the list pendants and refused to insure. Warren Ash's lender pulled out the same week. He terminated the purchase agreement by email. 4 sentences, no apology, and I have never heard from that man again. I understand he sold his interest in the Bell Harbor parcels that spring and moved to Florida, which is the most Warren Ash thing that could have happened. The deed was voided on April 22, 2005. A forged deed is a nullity. It doesn't transfer anything. It never did. Because a signature that isn't yours can't give away what's yours. Diane's lawyer filed an answer in February claiming Eli had orally authorized the transfer, then quietly stopped defending it after the prosecutor's office got involved. Ingrid got a default judgment. The order voiding instrument 2024, NELA 33817, was recorded at the Register of Deeds, and Paulette handed me the certified copy across the counter and said, good, and that was the whole conversation. Marlene Ostrander surrendered her notary commission in February, before the Department of State finished its investigation. She resigned from the dealership. She and Diane had been friends for 19 years, and as far as I know, they have not spoken since. The criminal side took 10 months. Investigator Dana Pruitt was thorough and unhurried and did not care even slightly about anybody standing in the community, which I found deeply restful. Diane was charged in June 2025. Forgery of a document affecting real property, uttering and publishing, and a third count related to the false notarization. She did not go to trial. In November 2025, she pled to 1 felony count. She got 3 years probation, restitution of just over $19,000. Our legal fees, the title work, the survey she'd ordered, and she is a convicted felon at 64 years old in a town where she ran the Christmas walk for 11 years. I've been asked whether I wanted her to go to jail. I have thought about it honestly, and the answer is no, and not because I'm gracious. It's because jail would have given her the one thing she has always needed, which is a story where she is the one being wrong. Probation gave her something worse. It gave her Tuesdays. It gave her a probation officer half her age with a caseload and a clipboard, asking a retired principal to verify her address. Grant's dealership was audited in March. Out of trust sales on 11 units. The finance company took the lot in May, and he's on a repayment plan that will follow him into his 50s. He was not criminally charged, which I have complicated feelings about and which is not my business. Paige and Grant separated in April. She kept the kids in the district. She sent me a text in June that said Mika asked why we don't see Grandma Diane. I told him the truth in a 9-year-old size. Thank you for making that possible. I read it in the parking lot at work and had to sit there a minute. And Diane lost the Fairmount house in October 22-5. Not because of us, but because of the home equity line she'd taken to feed the dealership. She's in a 2-bedroom apartment now. I'm told it's at Lakeview Commons. I did not laugh when I heard that, but I did have to leave the room. I want to be honest with you about the part nobody puts in these stories, because if you're in the middle of something like this right now, you deserve to hear it. Winning was not the same as being okay. For about 4 months after the family meeting, I was not a good person to live with. I checked the county records portal on our own property 3 or 4 times a week. I would sit up at 11 at night and pull our own parcel and read our own deed, like a woman checking that the stove was off. I caught me doing it in March and didn't say anything, just sat down next to me on the floor, and we both looked at a screenshot of a deed for a while, which is possibly the least romantic moment of our marriage and also one of the top 5. And Eli and I had to do real work, because let's not do this here happened. He said it. It was 4 words at a dinner table, and it cost us something real, and we did not get past it by being nice about it. We went to a counselor in Traverse City, a man named Peter, from February to September, every other Thursday. What came out of that room was that Eli had spent 36 years being managed, that the price of peace in his family had always been paid by whoever was least willing to make a scene, and for a long time that was him. And then he got married, and it became me, and he let it because he'd never seen it done any other way. He said one thing in that office in April that I think about constantly. Peter asked him what he was most afraid of, and he said, that I'm going to find out I'm like her. And Peter said, Ellis, you turned your phone off for 8 days so you couldn't be talked out of protecting your wife. She's never done a difficult thing in her life that didn't have an audience. You're not her. Eli didn't speak the rest of the session, but he stopped saying it after that. There's one more thing. In February, Eli drove to Fairmount Street alone and sat with his mother for 2 hours. He asked me first. I said yes, because he needed it and because I trusted him by then. He told me later that he'd gone to give her one chance, just one, to say a true sentence. He said he sat there for 2 hours and she talked about Rose's mental state, and the roof, and how the town was treating her, and how Grant had made mistakes, but he's your brother. And at the end he said, Mom, say you're sorry to Marin, that's all. One sentence, and I'll drive you out there right now. And Diane said, I'm sorry that it's been so hard on her. And Eli stood up and put his coat on and said, okay. That's the whole story of the last conversation between my husband and his mother. I'm sorry that it's been so hard on her. You can't fix that, and at some point trying to fix it is just a longer way of letting it keep happening. In May, we opened the back bedroom. It had been closed since October 3rd, 7 months. There was a fine layer of dust on the windowsill, and the stripped wallpaper was still curling off the wall in 3 places where Eli had left it in August. We stood in the doorway for a while. And I said, I don't want it to be a shrine. And he said, no. And I said, I also don't want to pretend. He said, then let's make it a room. We painted it a color called Harbor Fog, which is just gray with a little green in it, and it looks completely different at 7 in the morning than it does at 4 in the afternoon. And that's why Rose put her chair in there. In June, we started the licensing classes. We didn't tell anybody. 12 weeks, Tuesday nights, in a conference room in Traverse City with 11 other couples, and a woman from the county who had done this for 22 years and had a laugh like a screen door. Home study in August. Fire inspection in September, which we passed because Eli had rewired the entire house himself, and the inspector spent 20 minutes admiring the panel. We were licensed on October 9th, 2025. And on November 21st at 9:40 at night, our phone rang. Her name is Ren. She was 4 years old. She came to us with a backpack, a stuffed elephant with one ear, and a caseworker named Antoinette who stayed for an hour and a half and drank 2 cups of coffee and told us everything she was allowed to tell us. I'm not going to tell you Ren's story, because it isn't mine, and it isn't yours. I'll tell you that it's hard, and that she's a person, not a happy ending. The first night, she wouldn't sleep in the bed. She slept on the floor next to it, on the rug with the elephant, and Eli slept in the doorway on a camping pad for 5 nights until she didn't need him to. On the 6th morning I came down, and she was standing at the window in that back bedroom in her pajamas with the sun coming up over the bay, and she turned around and said, "There's a bird on the ice." There was. There was a cormorant on the ice. December 25th, 2005. We had it at the Cormorant House. 9 people. Aunt June, 82 now, in the wing chair by the fire, brandy in the coffee at 10 a.m., and unapologetic about it. My sister Hala and her husband and their boys down from Duluth, and it took them 7 hours because of a storm on the UP side. Paige and Mika and Josie. Ely, me, and Ren, 4 years old, in a red dress that she had opinions about, sitting on the floor by the tree. We ate at 5, at a table Eli built in November out of 2 slabs of ash that had been drying in the boatyard loft since 2019. It seats 9 badly and everybody's elbows touch, and that is the correct number of people for a house like that. Nobody made a speech. At one point Micah, 10 now, asked me, because 10-year-olds go straight at it, "Aunt Marin, is this the house Grandma tried to sell?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Did she get in trouble?" And I said, "She did. She got in a lot of trouble, and it wasn't fun, and none of it was your fault or your mom's fault." And he thought about it and said, "Okay," and asked if he could have another roll. That's it. That's all children need. They need one true sentence in a size they can carry. Here's the part I actually want to tell you. After dinner, June asked me to help her up out of the wing chair, and she took my arm and she walked me down the hall to the back bedroom, the one with the morning light, harbor fog on the walls, a small bed with a rail, a stuffed elephant with one ear, a dresser Eli made out of a piece of curly maple he'd had hidden in the boat shop since August of 2024, and which he did not talk about while he was making it, and which I did not ask about. And June stood in that doorway with her hand on my arm, and she said, "Diane told that room it wouldn't be needed." And I said, "She did." And June said, "Well, it's needed. There's one more thing, and then I'll let you go." In February of this year, a letter came, handwritten, Fairmount Street return address, crossed out, with the Lakeview Commons address written above it. I put it on the kitchen counter, and I did not open it for 9 days. I want to tell you that I burned it. That's the version people want, and I understand why. I opened it in my kitchen on a Sunday morning with coffee, and I read all 4 pages, and here's what was in them. 2 pages about her health. 1 paragraph about how the church had handled things poorly. A section about Rose, and Rose's decline, and what everyone in this family knows. A line about how she had made mistakes and how things were communicated. And on the last page 2 sentences about me. She wrote that she understood I was still angry and that she hoped one day I would be able to see the whole picture. There was no apology, not one, 4 pages, and she still hadn't found the sentence. And I sat there at my own table in my own house, in a chair. I refinished myself, and I waited for it, the drop, the rage, the hours of composing responses in my head at 2 in the morning. And it didn't come. I felt absolutely nothing. Not coldness, not triumph, just nothing. The way you'd feel reading a letter meant for somebody who used to live at your address. That's when I knew it was over, not the day the deed was voided, not the day she pled, that morning with the coffee going cold, when the most powerful woman I had ever known finally said her piece and it landed on me like a grocery flyer. I folded it up and put it in the drawer in the hall table, and then I went out to the back bedroom because it was 7:40 in the morning, and there was a small person in there who wakes up early and likes to look at the ice. If you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, here's the only advice I've got, and it's 4 things. 1. Believe the paperwork, not the person. People will explain themselves at you for hours. Documents just sit there and are true. When something feels wrong, stop arguing about feelings and go find the record. In this country, an astonishing amount of what's done to you is written down somewhere, by law, in a building you're allowed to walk into. 2. Don't warn them. The most important decision I made was the one that felt the worst. 9 days of saying nothing while my mother-in-law thought she'd won. Every hour I spent not confronting her was an hour she spent not building a defense. 3. Write it down the night it happens. Paige wrote down what she heard in the den, with the date, on Christmas Eve, because she'd been waiting years for somebody to do something. That note mattered. Your memory is going to get argued with. Paper doesn't get tired. 4. And this is the one. The reason it worked on me at that table for those 11 seconds is that I had been trained my whole life to believe that the worst thing a woman can do is make a scene at Christmas. Diane knew that. That's what the 14 witnesses were for. But there is no rule that says you have to make the scene when they schedule it. I didn't make a scene at her table on December 25th. I said thank you, and I got my coat, and I went to the county recorder's office at 8 in the morning, the day after Christmas, and I made the scene 11 days later, in my own living room, in front of the same 11 people, with a folder. She picked the audience. I picked the evening. Merry Christmas.